Okay, good afternoon from London and good evening from Singapore, everybody. My name is Stephen Murphy. I'm the moderator for today's this evening session, depending on where you are. I'm senior lecturer at in curating and museology at SOAS. I'm one of the co-organizers of the lecture series, along with my colleague Conan Cheong from the ACM. He's also one of the speakers tonight. But yeah, this is the third lecture in the series in the decolonizing, curating, and the museum in Southeast Asia. As I said, it's jointly run by both the Asian Civilisations Museum in Singapore and the Southeast Asian Art Academic Program here at SOAS. And also today, this lecture series is part of the ACMtalks series supported by the Chris Foundation. So again, many thanks to them for their support, as well as, of course, Alphawood Foundation and the Asian Civilisations Museum. There's two locations where you'll be able to access that. Okay, without any further ado, let me introduce today's speakers and the talk itself. Okay, so we have tonight's talk is Must We Decolonize the Museum, Sacred and Ritual Art, and the Raffles Museum Collection in Singapore. We are very lucky to have two active curators at ACM who are going to talk to us today. So we're going to have hopefully some insight. I think it's really important in this session and this series that we're also hearing from practitioners or people actively working in the museum in Southeast Asia, as well as academics and so forth. So yeah, we have Conan Cheong, who is the curator for Southeast Asia, and Faisal Husni, who is the assistant curator for Southeast Asia at the Asian Civilisations Museum. And they will speak for about 40 minutes. And then we have our fellow friend and colleague, Sujatha Arundathi Meegama from NTU Singapore, and she will act as respondent and the discussion. So just a little bit of background. Conan, as I said, he's recently promoted as curator, full curator of Southeast Asia. So congratulations there. He specializes in Hindu Buddhist art. He received an MA in art history and archaeology under the Alphawood scholarships at SOAS University of London in 2018. He's been at the ACM since 2013, and he's most recently curated Living with Ink, the collection of Dr. Tan Se Cho, 2019, and Fashionable in Asia, 2021. Faisal Husni is assistant curator for Island Southeast Asia at the ACM. He holds an MA in research from the School of Art, Design and Media, Nanyang Technological University here in Singapore. His research interests include multi-religious and multicultural heritage and spaces of worship, as well as religious art and traditions of Southeast Asia, with a focus on Keramat grades in Singapore and the Malay world. So without any further delay, I will hand over to both of you for tonight's talk. I think, Conan, are you up first? Or is it? Great, okay, thanks.
Great, thanks Stephen for that introduction. And hello everyone, thanks for tuning in today. It's great to see you all. I'd like to thank Alphawood Foundation and Chris Foundation for generous support of this lecture series, co-organizers Stephen, colleagues Denise and Jeff at ACM, and of course all our speakers and discussants for making this collaboration between SOAS and ACM on decolonizing, curating, and the museum such a productive one. Let me just share my screen. So my colleague Faisal and I today, we are going to approach this question, must we decolonize the museum? And I guess in some way it is a bit of a rhetorical question. As curators of the ACM in the Asian Civilisations Museum in Singapore, in terms of how can we enact decoloniality in our curatorial work, and so decoloniality following Walter Mignolo, as Stephen, Dara, and Pamela in the previous talks in this series have sort of cited, involves delinking from colonial structures of knowledge, of which museums have been a part of, to recenter local, indigenous, and community experiences. And a big part of curatorial work for me, the work of exhibition making, really involves narrativization, using artwork, objects, material culture, as nodal points to create narratives about culture, civilizations, and history. And I think this is part of how museums have been increasingly acknowledging our own subjectivity, that it is impossible to have an objective or a neutral exhibition space or gallery space. Said Hussein Alatas in his 1977 publication talks about how the image of the native constructed by colonialism has been an impediment to a profound and genuine understanding of native life. Alatas kind of analyzes rhetorical images, but these images of natives, of colonized peoples, I should say, are often embedded in objects in museum collections, how they were collected and studied and exhibited. So to me, that's why it's crucial in our work at the ACM to bring local, indigenous, and community voices in the way that we create narratives with objects. So the ACM, we are a national museum centered on global connections and cross-cultural exchanges in Asia. But we also inherited the what was called the ethnological collections of the 19th century Raffles Library and Museum. And with the sort of transformation of the Raffles Museum and Library into the National Museum, when Singapore gained independence from the British, there was a shift from colonial narratives to narratives that would serve the fledgling Singapore state. And so this can be kind of considered a state-directed decolonization. I work on Hindu and Buddhist art at the ACM, and actually most of our collection of Hindu and Buddhist art, here seen in our ancient religions gallery on the second floor, were in fact not inherited from the Raffles Museum Library, and actually acquired by the ACM after it was conceived in the 90s, with a mission to represent the ancestral cultures of Singapore. And of course, religion is regarded as a key aspect of heritage of Singapore, of the heritage of these newly created citizens of Singapore. So they were acquired really to represent Buddhists and Hindus in Singapore. The notable exception actually are the Bujang Valley finds from Kedah, which were excavated by Dorothy and H.G. Quaritch Wales in the 30s and 1941. And these clay ceilings from the Thai Malay Peninsula. And right now we have them in a showcase in our ancient religions galleries called Southeast Asia, the arrival of Hinduism and Buddhism. And they're kind of being used to show the earliest traces of Hinduism and Buddhism in Southeast Asia. And this display is something that I've been trying to reassess. And I kind of want to talk about these clay tablets to illustrate the kind of research that perhaps curators and other interested researchers can do on the collection in documenting the histories of how objects were really collected and interpreted. And through doing this, we can perhaps identify the colonial narratives that may be embedded in them, and then depart from these narratives, or to put other narratives, community voices, local voices in dialogue with them. So very briefly, because this is not going to be the main subject of my talk, what are these ceilings? They are images of the Buddha made in large quantities by the application of molds to wet clay to create merit for better rebirth for Buddhist practitioners. And they're often also stamped on the back with the so-called Ye Dharma stanza, which is a teaching of the Buddha about causation, as Peter Skilling has written about. And many of them on the Thai Malay Peninsula were found in caves. And there's something about these tablets in the Raffles Museum's collection. This is just sort of what is in the collection. Even though they form such a small proportion of its collection, and the Raffles Museum was focused on zoology and ethnography, they received kind of a disproportionate amount of attention as objects of study. Often referred to in scholarly journals of the time, the colonial period, and were frequently the subject of inquiry in correspondence with the museum. And one example, I found some Raffles Museum correspondence from 1939, where E.H. Johnston, who a professor of Sanskrit at the University of Oxford, is kind of desperate to borrow objects from the Raffles Museum he can use to show how the Malay Peninsula was actually part of a greater India. the very tenacious idea that Southeast Asia was colonized and civilized by ancient India in the sort of golden age. But Evan Chazin, the director of the museum at the time, says Indian antiquities are so scarce in the Malay Peninsula here that they are all treated as very precious stones, and he wishes that he will ask for anything else, even gold. Which I find quite interesting. So how do we really begin to make sense of this? Diana Carroll has identified the pattern of British scholarship in the Malay Peninsula in the 19th century, where Islam was dismissed in favor of Hindu Buddhist elements, which were taken as signs of civilization, and the primitive native or aboriginal elements, which kind of tied in with the idealization of the noble savage and folklore studies, which are very gaining ground at the time. And so these Hindu Buddhist elements that were found by men like Marsden and Raffles plugged the Malay Peninsula into the international network of antiquarians who were studying these things. And so how does this really play out at the Raffles Museum itself? So, first of all, as Carol notes, significant Hindu Buddhist archaeological monuments were actually not found in the Malay Peninsula. And so there were very few opportunities to collect, with the notable exceptions that I've already addressed. And the museum was divided into zoology and ethnology. The galleries were organized as such. But at the same time, the search kind of continued for material remains of Hindu-Buddhist presence in Malaya to try and link contemporary Malays to the Indian civilizations. And so even though these clay tablets, when they entered the collection, they were usually classified under ethnology, they didn't quite fit. They were seen as something greater, as traces of this civilizing mission of the greater India. And I find this sort of disjuncture quite interesting in how these objects were seen. So the first period where we really see the tablets coming into the Raffles Museum collection is at the turn of the 20th century, around 1893 to 1904, collected by Kinnersley, Vaughan Stevens, and A.D. Machado. And this kind of collecting was very opportunistic. It was a kind of casual collecting that took place when these colonial administrators, these explorers, prospectors were engaged in other forms of activity. And zooming in on these two tablets, and I can't find them in our collection right now, but they were, so they're not, they don't seem, there isn't really a record of them at the moment, but they were given actually by the tin prospector A.D. Machado, by all accounts, the most enthusiastic giver of objects to the Raffles Museum. And this is a list of what he donated in 1896. The Siamese coins and images, which probably include these two, and other things like mineralogical specimens, gold, quartz, and tin ore, Chinese guns, the skull of a Pangan Aboriginal, baskets, and so on. And it seems like a very eclectic range of objects. And not everything that was published in these records can be found in our records today, including the skull. But here are some other things that he donated to the museum, which is collected in Pahang. These are objects that are associated with tribal communities living in Pahang at the time. And Machado was a prospector associated with the Malayan Pahang Exploration Company. And so this is how he kind of came into contact with these tribal communities and collected these objects. So, from this kind of little case study, it's kind of reflective of a wider context of scholarship in the Malay world, of the Malay world at this time, at the turn of the 20th century, with the growing interest in studying wild tribes or pagan races, as these communities were called. And to be more correct, we should refer to them by the names, the Semai, Temia, Batek, and other communities. And there was a kind of urgency as well, where the British scholar administrators believed that the original culture of the Malay Peninsula was actually dying out due to contact not just with the West, but also the Indian, Chinese, and even Malay civilization. And And this also kind of, the Raffles Museum was kind of caught up in this as well, these developments. In 1903, rooms in the upper floor of the museum were actually refurnished and opened to the galleries, opened to the public as ethnological galleries. And in the bulletin, they're said to be the best lit and ventilated rooms in the museum, together with new showcases, and they appear much more attractive than the other galleries. In 1906, this is the publication of the research of Skeet and Blagden's Pagan Races of the Malay Peninsula, which was the first attempt by professional researchers to kind of systematize all these observations made by colonial administrators and travelers of these tribal communities. So it reflected a kind of turning point in how they were being studied. So moving on to another set of fragments in our ACM collection that were collected in the Raffles Museum period. These fragments that were found in Perlis, and they're interesting because it appears that according to Gibson Hill, who was later director of the Raffles Museum as well, in the display, in the label, we kind of mixed up 17 objects, 17 of these fragments given by Vaughan Stevens in 1893, so part of this earlier period that we've been talking about. And they were mixed in with 22 collected by H.D. Collins, who was a curator at the Raffles Museum in 1937. So I've not really been able to inspect these in person yet. So in formal terms, they look exactly the same, made of this reddish clay, and also impressed with these Buddhist motifs. This later collection by Collins actually reflects a shift in how the Malay Peninsula was being studied in the 30s. Collins had, collected these in Perlis, which was a British protectorate at the time. And as part of a major 3-year archaeological survey of the prehistory of the Malay Peninsula in the states of Kedah, Pahang, Kelantan, Perak, and Perlis. And interestingly, this is because in the 1935 Congress of Prehistorians of the Far East held in Manila, the Raffles Museum was actually selected to be kind of the repository for prehistoric objects from the whole of the further east. And coming with this was also funding from the Carnegie Corporation of New York. The museum was actually awarded $12,000 at the time, 20,000 in Straits currency, for the museum to do this 3-year prehistoric survey. And part of the money also funded new showcases for a new hall of Asiatic prehistory. And the motivation behind this is, kind of out of my scope for now, but suffice to say that this connection with, Asiatic prehistory plugged the museum into another far-ranging scholarly network. And records show that in the next few years, fossils, casts of ancient man, typological series of stone implements started to circulate in from the Perak Museum, the Australian Museum, Oyama Institute in Japan, and the Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology in Cambridge, among others, to furnish these new galleries. So Collins actually sent these fragments he found to Georges Sedès at the EFEO in Hanoi. And Sedès's reply, where he identifies and kind of classifies these objects, these fragments are published in the bulletin for that year. And that's just a page from Collins's archaeological report in the bulletin. And this is indicative of this connection that was forged through the Hindu Buddhist the interest in Hindu Buddhist elements of the Malay Peninsula. Sedès, known most for his popularization of the Indianization theory of Southeast Asia, wrote a much cited comprehensive survey article in 1926, which was titled Siamese Votive Tablets, where he furthered Fouché's theory that these tablets are souvenirs for pilgrims. So I don't really have time to critique this theory, and in any case, Peter Skilling again has done so in a series of articles. But what I want to point out today is that at the end of the article, Sedès writes that it was Prince Damrong, who's known as the father of kind of modern art history, or art history in the Western tradition in Thailand, was the one who actually consolidated all the tablets, all such tablets dispersed in private collections in Thailand, which you can imagine coming also from different temple collections, into the National Museum collection. So the Museum of the Royal Institute is the National Museum of Bangkok today. And Damrong and Sedes was interested in these things as art historical objects and tried to classify them according to scientific principles. But this actually, to me, hints at how they were actually collected and valued all over Thailand, even before this consolidation. And so, in the final part of my presentation, I just want to use this chance maybe to hint at some alternative narratives about these clay tablets that can be read in dialogue with the Hindu Buddhist traces. So Annandale, who's an ethnologist in 1904, reports how the local people in Yala province, who were Muslim, actually believed that these Hantu Parai spirits made these Buddhist tablets that were found in many of the caves. In 1964, Alistair Lamb, who in the 60s did a number of excavations in the Malay Peninsula, also looking for Hindu-Buddhist elements, tried to do a scientific examination of a cave in Perlis where these clay tablets were found, but was sorely disappointed because nearby Buddhist monks, regarding the clay tablets as sacred, actually collected all of them and removed them to the temple where they ground them up to serve as material for a new image. So he came away very disappointed, not being able to determine the stratigraphic relationship of the tablets in the cave to the rest of the cave deposit, as he says. So it's interesting to me how these are hints in the record of these academics and scholars in the articles of alternative viewpoints, alternative narratives that they kind of chose to downplay or to ignore. And of course, you can't avoid talking about the connection of these clay tablets to the popularity of the cult of amulets in Thailand, which actually kind of arose in the reign of Mongkut and Chulalongkorn. So the clay tablets were not originally used as amulets, of course, but they became kind of incorporated into this new cult of amulets. And as Pataraton Charapravati, who spoke in our first lecture of the series, wrote, they are kind of the practice of stamping these votive tablets actually continues in this new passion for amulets. In our 2012 exhibition Enlightened Ways, which was curated by Heidi Tan, and where we borrowed many objects from museums in Thailand, we also had a section on these living traditions that in Thailand, in Buddhist Thailand, and with a showcase of these amulets. So it's really important to show the continuation of these traditions in contemporary form. So just to kind of finish on this slide, actually, just wanted to say that in 2018, the ACM we've completed a sort of major renovation and renewal of our permanent galleries, and as part of this, we inaugurated our second floor Faith and Belief galleries, with galleries dedicated not just to Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism, but also the sacred and ritual art of other religions, in major religions in Asia, in Southeast Asia, including Christianity, Islam, Taoism, and Confucianism, and communities like the Batak, Dayak, and so on. And we are working very closely with local communities in Singapore for showcases on Sikhism, Judaism, and Zoroastrianism. And so perhaps this could be a good transition to Faisal's presentation, to say that we've been working and our other departments at ACM as well, including our audience team, who made this really wonderful video featuring members of the interreligious organization in Singapore, reacting and kind of adopting our objects in our collection as a possibility to how we can kind of encourage the insertion or the incorporation of multiple narratives, multiple voices in the way we talk about sacred and ritual art at the museum. Yeah, so with that, we pass the time on to Faisal. Let me stop sharing here.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you so much. I'd like to firstly thank Alphawood Foundation and the Chris Foundation, like Conan has mentioned, also to SOAS and Stephen and all our colleagues, including especially Denise, for helping us with this. So I have been an assistant curator here at ACM for barely a year, actually. November will be my first year. However, I still hope I can offer some insights into what we do and what we have done and all our approaches and our aims to decolonize the collection and the museum. And to the title, must we decolonize the museum? As Conan mentioned, it's a rhetorical question. So in my opinion, yes, we should. The question is how? As Conan has beautifully described the history of Raffles Library and Museum collection, I don't have to go through it again, because if I did, I wouldn't have been able to do it as elegantly. But one thing I wish to highlight is that some of the records of some of the objects have records that include payments or purchases or mentions of purchases. And by records, I mean it would usually just say it was bought by so-and-so from so-and-so. However, if these can be accepted as factual and correct, then there are some objects that were actually purchased, though this was not information that was available for like all of the objects. It's only some if we're lucky. This is with regards to the Raffles Library and Museum collection. And also that means I can't make bold claims about looting or violent means of acquiring these objects in the past, but we can just acknowledge the possibility. Besides, even if the acquiring isn't violent, the way they were displayed and categorized can be argued as violent. And there also seems to be a tradition of traveling and collecting and that contributed to the amassing of this collection. So individuals connected to the library and museum would go around Southeast Asia and collect objects and bring them back. And in the collection, we also have ethnographic photographs that are undeniably problematic. These are obviously evidence of ethnographic and anthropological endeavors, and these could also have led to the collecting of objects. Another thing I wish to add also is that ACM currently resides in what was an old colonial governmental office building, and it used to house a number of governmental offices and departments, including, ironically or not, the immigration department at some point. And I'm still trying to figure out which room or gallery this space was, because it'd be interesting, a space to conduct curatorial interventions on the other and who gets othered throughout history. So yes, the Southeast Asian collection is dripping with colonial legacies and histories, and we have to really work hard to address and decolonize the collection and the museum. And this also goes for objects that are acquired after the division of the Raffles Library and Museum collection and also the formation of ACM. And as I mentioned, I'm very new to this role. So my work and these approaches are still in their beginning stages or haven't seen their fruits yet. But I shall share some of the initiatives ACM has done that are in line with the efforts and ethos of decolonizing, and also some examples from other institutions and organizations that I feel are worth emulating. We are currently working on a project that we have unoriginally called the National Collection Research Project, and this is something that a few museums in Singapore are doing with our Heritage and Conservation Center. For those who may not know, most of the museums in Singapore are national museums. So all of our collections are part of the Singapore's national collection, which are then subdivided into the different museum collections. And one of the aims of this project, at least for us at ACM, is to research on the old Raffles Library and Museum collection within ACM's larger collection. And we have a couple of researchers who are working on this with me. A little shout out to them, Cheong and Khairul Jaffni Jukri. And what they've been doing is to relook at write-ups meant for the online data, our online database, based on newer scholarship and also local and regional scholarship. And we start seeing some instances where earlier, often very old writings or curator notes that may be uninformed, to put it gently. And I've seen, for example, earlier older notes from the collection describing an image from Java as an ogre, when it's most likely actually one of the comedic archetypes of the Javanese theater traditions. Another example I like to use is the chili, because it's the simplest to illustrate this problem, the chili from Bali. Firstly, it has been labeled as rice spirit, and this is obviously not correct, or at the very least, it doesn't correctly describe what a chili is, which is an offering, but it could also be a form of residence for a deity, not a spirit, but a deity, the goddess Dewi Sri, namely. But at the same time, there may be people within the Balinese community who may not view the form as being specifically dedicated to Dewi Sri, because the Balinese traditions and the traditions of Balinese Hinduism is diverse and very plural. And the religious and ritual complexity of the object is absent and cannot be described in rice spirit. So the entry will eventually be updated to use the term to use the term chili as the object name, and then a write-up that reflects the newer and local scholarship of the material, because there have been so much research on such materials since this object was acquired in 1918, apparently. And it's a no-brainer, right, that we have to keep updating such content, but I have to admit, it sounds pretty daunting if we have such a large collection. Another reason why looking at local scholarship, I feel, is so important is that they often involve community interviews, surveys, and most importantly, perspectives. And these are lacking in most earlier Western scholarship, especially the perspectives and the voices. We should also look at writings and research in local or regional languages specifically. With the Chile, for example, research in Bahasa Indonesia was very, very useful from some of the universities in Indonesia. I remember having a discussion with some people, and someone mentioning, what if we just can't assess the language, we don't know the language? And I think that's where collaboration would come in. I think it was Professor Nancy from Binghamton University who pointed out that in the field of hard sciences and medicine, for example, collaboration is instinctive, expected even. So I think our field it should be the same for our field. We should collaborate across the globe. You'll also find, with regards to study of objects in this region, you can find the same claims being made of certain objects about something, and then discover that it reaches all the way back from citation to citation, from publication to publication, to Western sources or colonial writings that may or may not have taken into consideration community perspectives and the diversity of these perspectives. And sadly, these claims often become solidified and taken as fact. And to use the chili again, you'll often read about how the chili image, like on this lama, is representative of the goddess Dewi Sri. But thankfully, through local research that actually engaged with the Balinese communities, you'll realize that it's not a homogeneous belief at all, that some people have differing opinions within the community about who or what the figure represents. And another thing this project has highlighted is also the fallibility of translations, especially to English. Firstly, I think this prioritizing of English terms specifically needs to stop. If we can be okay with terms like kimono to be untranslated, we can work towards chili, for example, being untranslated, or even sirah salawa or hampatong, or we could use those local words and terms first and then spend time and text explaining them after, and make this way of education a norm. Because often you can't translate things perfectly in just a word or two as substitutes. And sometimes in doing so, you layer additional meaning over the subject. For example, when translating Rakshasa to demons, words describing the goddess Rangda as a witch, which doesn't work. And also the words come with so much baggage from Western traditions. Another word I think we should stop using with regards to Southeast Asia is magic. And I've seen this used countless times to describe traditions, especially religious traditions in Southeast Asia. And that comes obviously with so much problems. Another word, and Conan has mentioned this earlier as well, that tribe is another word I often avoid for very good reasons. I've also encouraged the researchers to use regionally appropriate or specific terms where possible or relevant. So a Chris Blade, for example, say from Kelantan, the community might refer to it as Bila Chris. However, communities in Java, for example, depending on the community, they might call it a Wila instead, Wila Chris. The sheath, collectively, they might often be called sarung, but depending on the communities in Indonesia, they might specifically call it a warangka. So I think this specificity is very important. And then we'll just add the English term as a means of explaining, but not replacing those local terms and those very specific terms. But yes, the priority is on the local terms. I actually want to go further than this and end the italicizing of non-English terms, but I've been told that's way too radical for now, but there is a logic to it. It's one of the small ways in which writing others a community. So maybe we should. Anyways, this project is currently ongoing, but it's grounded in our aims to decolonize the collection and the museum. And one of our efforts to ensure that we don't only rely on certain sources of knowledge, and Conan again has mentioned this earlier, and when I mean rely on certain sources of knowledge, I mean like Western sources, colonial sources, or even just scholarly sources in general. The way to do it is to work with communities, and we have, as we mentioned earlier, worked with the inter-religious organization, IRO, here in Singapore, where possible, to ensure that the objects that of the different faiths and religions are presented and represented as sensitively as possible. And this working with communities is useful and necessary so that we don't repeat this top-down approach or we know better approach of colonial museums and scholarship or older museums and scholarship, because we don't always know better, right? Sometimes even our visitors and our audience can be our teachers and our experts as well. And something I've been trying to do is to reach out to a few communities in Southeast Asia or organizations within the regions that are locally run or work closely with the communities. I have to admit, starting some of these relationships during the pandemic has been difficult. I've been successful in some attempts, and I've been able to gain community perspectives and information. Others, however, I'm still working to gain their trust so that we can eventually work together and work with them on future collaborations where all parties have a say and stake in it and how they benefit from these collaborations and not just the museums benefiting from it. Some of the organizations I wish to highlight include Ranulum Foundation, a non-profit organization that helps communities in Kalimantan, but also work in educating people about traditional practices of the different and diverse Dayak communities. And also they focus a lot on environmental preservation and protection. Another organization is Threads of Life that does work with different local textile makers and highlight their practices and stories. And while my efforts are still in their infancy stages, many other institutions have done very successful collaborations with communities. And I won't go into too much details on them because my fanboying would take up an entire hour. But I do encourage you to look them up. The first is the Ohio State University Center for Folklore Studies, and they have very interesting community collaborations with communities from Appalachian, Ohio. There are talks by Dr. Jasper Waugh-Kozabath you can easily find on YouTube that describes the initiatives in detail. And the ethos behind these collaborations is that the researcher is a learner and an apprentice and not the expert, and that the relationship is reciprocal, and a focus from just being an observer to a relationship where exchanges can happen. One of these initiatives encourage students and student researchers to work with and for different community organizations to assist in building local archives that would serve the communities, be accessible to the communities easily, and could be easily run by these communities if or when the researchers would have to leave. Another initiative that I really admire is that they found ways to bring local community members as experts where non-academics would often not be able to access, like conferences or lectures. So if we ever have future iterations of the program that we have today, we should consider bringing in members from the different communities and have them talk and speak. Another amazing initiative I admire is the Re-Entanglements Project, which is a collaboration or partnership between SOAS, led by Dr. Paul Basu, and other institutions, including University of Nigeria and Nsukka, Igbo Studies Initiative, University of Cambridge, Institute of Benin Studies, University College London, Nasona Studios, National Museum Lagos, University of Benin, Auchi Polytechnic, British Library Sound Archives, the Pitt Rivers Museum, the Royal Anthropological Institute, the Royal Botanic Gardens, QN, UK National Archives. I feel like it's only fair that I mentioned all of them. Anyway, one of their projects from this initiative is the Faces Voices project, where all anthropological photographs from surveys of Nigeria and Sierra Leone are presented to contemporary participants from the communities to respond to them, who they think the people in the photographs were, what they did, how they felt, giving voice to the voiceless. And my favorite bit was also a part where these participants were presented with the photographs of the anthropologist himself. And ACM has a collection of ethnographic photographs, and I've been trying to figure out how to address them and work with them. And this project has, I think, provided one solution, one possible approach. Another way we have been working with communities and working to make sure that their voices are presented, especially as experts, is through the acquiring of objects from them, not just from auction houses or dealers. And this has been a part of the collection strategies of ACM over the lifespan of ACM, and it still is. One significant example is from one of our earlier research projects where video documentation was done on the making of this very Kelantanese kris made by Nik Rashidi Nik Hussein, who is the brother of Nik Rashidi Nik Hussein, who is a renowned and acclaimed kris maker and wood carver, and also Mazlan Mat, who was the metalsmith here. The good thing about collecting from the community is that we get the names of the makers so we can highlight them. This sets our methodology a bit apart from the colonial approaches of collecting from the community, where the makers often remain anonymous. Instead, the collectors are the ones highlighted. The documentation also allowed us to show the process, or to view the process and document the process. We also get snippets of conversations of the makers while they chatted as they worked, if you can understand Kelantanese Malay, of course. It is, I admit, a little voyeuristic, so I have to admit that, but it did reveal interesting perspectives of these makers. They had very pointed opinions, for example, of young Malay youths in Singapore. And our director, Kenny Ting, is very supportive of what we call collecting the contemporary. And these include objects from the communities. It also allows us to compare older objects with their newer counterparts to discuss possible evolutions of traditions. Currently, the Ancestor and Rituals Gallery here at ACM has this monumental responsibility of housing objects from Southeast Asia, excluding the ones that are Hindu, Buddhist, Islamic or Islamicate, and Christian. And our approach currently at the moment is to display the objects of each culture or community in its own space. And the aim is to allow each culture to be able to be addressed within their own context, yet still acknowledge possible diversities, and to not present a homogeneous Southeast Asia or hodgepodge approach, or what the Singaporeans or people of the region would call rojak. But of course, the downside is that some of the connections between the different communities become diminished. And some of these communities have been interacting with one another way before colonialism came into the picture. They were trading, they were intermarrying, they were sometimes in conflict. So we are always aiming to improve our approach. But I guess even if the perfect approach is not reached at the moment, the space is still valuable in initiating conversations, perspectives, and even criticisms. And these are all valuable information we are constantly absorbing. I especially appreciate talking to students about the space, because the younger generation of academics and researchers, they're so much more in tune with conversations about colonialism and decolonizing of museums and knowledge in general, and they have very interesting take on things. I also feel that galleries and exhibitions cannot shoulder everything or the heavy lifting of decolonizing. Tours are very useful ways to help push out alternative narratives. When I speak to our wonderful docents, I encourage them to relate alternative narratives and invisible connections between the different communities when, spatially in the gallery, the objects of these communities might be far apart. lectures like what we have today is another way we could do that. We also have programs where we bring out objects and give longer talks about them when labels do not have the sufficient textual real estate to do so. And many museums have done this. We're not the only ones, hardly the first one as well. One of my favorites is the Curator's Corner by the British Museum. But of course, the methodology of the programming here, it's not where the decolonizing happened. It's the knowledge and it's information. They need to be current as far as possible, and also from local and regional scholarship as much as possible, especially those that work with local communities and in their languages, because decolonizing cannot happen if the community voices and agencies are still bottled and not part of the process. They need to be participants in this and not just subjects of study. And that's where I end. Thank you so much. I think Stephen.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Faisal. I was getting so caught up in your talk, you caught me unawares. Yeah, that's great. Thank you to both Conan and Faisal for their excellent overviews within the very short time limit. Yeah, we're going to have about a 20-minute discussion and response before we then turn to the Q&As from the audience. So, so I'd like to, on that note, introduce our discussant for today. It's Assistant Professor Sujatha Arundathi Meegama. She's at the Nanyang Technological Institute in Singapore. She trained at Temple University, Japan, Stanford University, and the University of California, Berkeley. Prior to joining NTU, she worked at the Art Institute of Chicago. She is the editor of Sri Lanka Connected Art Histories, that's Mumbai 2017, and she has published articles in Art of Asia and Archives of Asian Art. Currently, she is completing a book manuscript on the transnational Dravidiya tradition of architecture in the Indian Ocean. So, Sujatha, over to you.
Thank you, Stephen, for introduction, and good morning. And good afternoon, good evening to all of you who are joining from all over the world. And a big thank you to Stephen, Conan, and Faisal for inviting me to be part of this exciting conversation on decolonizing museums in Southeast Asia. I'm going to try to share a few brief comments as part of a response, and then have a conversation with Conan and Faisal about their thought-provoking talks. I'm just going to try to figure out how to share my screen. Okay, I think that's done. So my very first encounter with the Asian Civilisations Museum was in 1999 when I was passing through Singapore on my way back to my then job and home at the Art Institute of Chicago. The ACM was then located at the Town and School, the former Town and School, a 3-story building from 1910, funded by Chinese merchants as well as through a public donation drive. This is the home of the first modern Chinese school on this island. I was seeing the ACM 2 years after its opening at this location on Armenian Street. Then in 2003, the ACM moved to its current location on the banks of the Singapore River to a national monument. Dating to 1867, the Empress Place building is a colonial garment structure, as was shared before by the curators, which was built by Indian convict labor. As Dr. Kenson Kwok, the first director of the ACM, says, quote, "The Asian Civilization Museum is both a very young and a very old museum," end of quote. He, of course, is alluding to the many lives of this museum, whose seed collection, as we heard from both Conan and Faisal, began with the Raffles Library and Museum. The ACM certainly has had many lives, and its identity is still changing, as we heard in the current director Kenny Ting's call for decolonization at the beginning of this webinar series. So in my ruminations today, I will briefly trace these many lives, and then at the end, I'll hope to have a conversation with Conan and Faisal about some of the issues that they brought up in their talks. We often read that unlike other museums of the wider region, the ACM is not a museum that focuses on telling a story about the nation state, but is instead dedicated to presenting Asian art and culture. And yet, from its inception, it was to promote a great appreciation of the ancestral cultures of Singaporeans. In its first incarnation at the former Townan School, the emphasis was on Chinese civilization, which was justified by then director Kenson Kwok due to availability of loans from Hong Kong, as well as the demographics in Singapore. In its next incarnation, as an Asian art museum at the Empress Place, the ACM followed the traditional organization of most Asian art museums in the world. It was organized into 4 regional clusters: China, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and West Asia. Cultures were compartmentalized and displayed with clear boundaries. These divisions also invoke the CMIO model: Chinese, Malay, Indian, and other, although the other was not present. This diversity management technique, or a tool of social control, has been present on these islands since the British colonial period. Although the term national is not part of the ACM's formal name, the idea of the nation was and is still very much present, not only in the museum's mission, but also on the ground in the physical galleries. In the Ideas of Asia and the Museum, Sonia S. Lee points out how most museums are organized by, quote, geography with the intention of reflecting the work's purported place of origin, end of quote. In the second incarnation, the ACM clearly reflected this geography-based organization through its galleries and collecting practices. Moreover, the exhibition designs created by GSM design further contextualize the artworks in various ways to reveal their uses or the location that they would have been originally seen in. The display evoked South Indian temples with their long pillared halls where dances performed offerings to the deity in the central sanctum. Chinese Buddhist steles were placed in dark alcoves with projections of Chinese cave temples, as well as sacred beings that made visitors feel as if they were indeed stepping into a sacred site in China. Cambodian lintels were displayed above eye level with projections of a Cambodian temple above. A visitor was given a chance to enter a temple-like space to study or worship a central image while circumambulating and viewing other sculptures. In the Islamic gallery, a projection of a mihrab gave visitors a sense of the interiors of a mosque as objects related to a mosque were displayed. In short, these galleries were simply stunning. But in 2014, all this changed when the ACM embarked on another new journey. The new ACM moves away from the geography-based mode of display. Under the guidance of its second director, Dr. Alan Cheong, the ACM began to display objects in a new way, that is, along the shared themes of trade, faith and belief, and materials and design. This revamp in phases included change in the museum's mission, that is, focusing on, quote, historical connections between cultures and civilizations in Asia and between Asia and the world, end of quote. Yet the ACM's new curatorial narratives reflect Singapore's own history of trade and migration as a port city. In other words, the nation state is still very much present as an underlying narrative. The new direction was publicly revealed through a special exhibition in 2013, Devotion and Desire Cross-Cultural Art in Asia. A series of exhibitions since then has explored the global term in various ways. The Tang Shipwreck, China Mania, Christianity in Asia, Port Cities, Angkor, and Raffles in Southeast Asia, just to name a few. In the introductory essay for the catalogue for that inaugural exhibition in 2013, Alan Cheong, the then director of the ACM, challenges the emphasis on national narratives that are often seen at museums throughout the world. In its questioning of national narratives, the ACM has begun to engage with global art histories, which narrate stories beyond the nation state as a unit of analysis. Here, I'm reminded of Mary D. Sharif's imaginary visit to a museum in her edited volume, Cultural Contact and the Making of European Art. And I'm just sharing that with you. She begins by describing the various rituals we participate in when we visit a museum, like buying a ticket, grabbing a map, and then rushing around from room to room to catch as many objects as we can before we have museum fatigue. She ends by saying, quote, "When your circuit seems complete, you again consult the floor plan, just to make sure you have seen it all. And now you notice that there is a department of Islamic art one floor up, and that the arts of China and Latin America are located in an entirely different building," end of quote. But in the new ACM, a French sugar caster is placed alongside a Chinese imari sugar caster, which in turn is engaging with the then craze for Japanese imari ware. In the new ACM, we can see the proclamation that bans Christianity in Japan, along with the Tang Dynasty wrapping that mentions the arrival of Christianity in China. The world is in one vitrine, in one gallery, or on one floor. This initiative to engage with the global could be interpreted as a move to decolonize as well. First and foremost, it is a move to distance the museum from the CMIO model, a classification system that began 100 years ago. This engagement with the global turn, moreover, reminds us that this was indeed art histories, that is the discipline's own solution to decolonize itself. That is a deep and sustained critique of its Eurocentric priorities. That is questioning the centers, canons, models, and including or inviting bodies and new voices. The project of global art is often confused with non-Western art history. It is also not a narrative about East meets West. Neither does global art history entail taking the whole globe as a framework of analysis. What then is global art history? To simply put it, it is about going beyond the nation state and creating narratives that straddle traditional boundaries and proposes innovative comparisons. That is what we see in these new galleries at the ACM. And it also gives us an opportunity to discuss art produced during the colonial encounter and to even discuss colonialism. It also gives us a chance to go beyond the traditional canon, as we heard in Conan and Faisal's talks. In this dramatic transformation of the ACM, we have a unique example of an Asian art museum, that is a museum in Asia, playing an active role in initiating changes to the display of Asian art histories. We need to recognize and acknowledge it. But as Monica Juneja reminds us, engaging with global art histories also means to engage with the incommensurability of encounters. Any museum has objects forcibly taken or objects that remind us of the tragedies of colonial violence. This too, the ACM has begun to grapple with. And I look forward to this new phase when we will begin to see and hear more narratives about friction, discord, disunity, and resistance that do not portray our world only through rose-tinted glasses. And I think I'll stop here as it's 8 o'clock in Singapore, and we should start on our conversation, I guess, and our discussion with Conan and Faisal, and then move on to the Q&A.
Conan, or would you like to respond to some of, or would you like to ask them a specific question?
Well, I actually wanted to start off by the discussion by actually thanking Conan and Faisal for giving, I guess, those of us who teach Asian art histories a challenge to go beyond the traditional canon of what we include in our lectures by getting us to look at these objects that we just simply walk past in the galleries, such as those precious but humble ceilings, or the chili that Faisal was bringing attention to. Yes, we try to, we do send the students out to the ACM, or 200 of them, the first years, for their presentations, and we try our best to encourage students to go beyond the Buddhas, the Gandharan Buddhas, or the walking Buddhas, or the Ganeshas, or the beautiful Chola bronzes, but in getting us to really look carefully at these objects, I think gives us maybe an opportunity for us to try to see how we can include them in our own lectures, and then slowly starting including them in what we teach as part of the canon. But your talks also touched upon a couple of other issues, the issue of collecting and, of course, collectors. And I was struck by how, the title of our panel has a famous collector's name, Western colonial collector. But then when I listened to your talks, I was also hearing the presence of local collectors, or other collectors and other types of collecting. And of course, I'm also thinking of the galleries themselves. One of my favorite galleries is the little gallery that's nestled between the Singapore Archaeology Gallery and the Maritime Trade Gallery, that highlights those wonderful ceramics, the medicine jars, or the heirloom textiles, and which clearly tell us that people in this region were collectors, and perhaps they were collecting different types of objects from what the anthropologists and the adventurers and the naturalists and the missionaries started collecting, that sort of formed the earlier colonial collection of the ACM. And also I'm thinking of, when we also think about narratives of plunder, I'm especially thinking of one of your final exhibitions, Stephen, Jimmy Ong's installation. And when we listen to that narrative of plunder of the palace, or when I think of my own research, the plundering of the Temple of the Tooth Relic, or the Royal Treasury by Portuguese troops in the 16th century in Sri Lanka, or we think of the Kingdom of Benin being plundered and all those beautiful bronzes being taken to London. In these narratives of plunder, we also hear of collectors and collections. So I'm just wondering, how do we begin to start, I guess, moving away from this emphasis of colonial collections and colonial collecting to start looking at how local collections and collectors were also collecting? I guess it's kind of a broad question for both of you to get us started.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Sujatha. Maybe I can kind of take it first, Faisal, if you don't mind. I think, I think first thing is that there's a bit of an error in the title, I feel, because it says Raffles Collection, but actually it should be Raffles Museum Collection, because obviously the Raffles Collection all went, to the British Museum, and some of it was lost at sea. It's interesting that, of course, so the Raffles Museum collection was really built up by many collectors, not just those associated with colonial sort of occupations, but also, as you know, in the very first place, the opening of the museum component of the Raffles Library and Museum actually began in 1849 with the donation of 2 gold coins by the Temenggung Ibrahim of Johor. So in a way, in a way, the collection really began with those two items. Can't really find them now in the collection. The record isn't really there, but I would say that is indicative of how there was really a buy-in from all sectors of the community when it comes to collecting. But obviously we can't deny that violence was definitely a big part of or one of the forms of collecting in the colonial period. Although I have to say that with some notable exceptions, the majority of, as I said, the Raffles Museum collection was a big part of it was zoological, and it was really collected by people in sort of these scientific expeditions to collect samples of all sorts of different specimens in the region. Yeah, just trying to kind of, Faisal, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I think you have a very good point, and it's something that we definitely are thinking about with regards to local collectors, because some of these communities, some of our communities that we've been collecting, God knows how long, even before colonialism came into the picture. The Batak communities were collecting different ceramics from China, for example. So were the Dayak communities. But we don't we don't highlight them as, or we don't consider them collectors. Why not? We should. We might not have their names, but we should at least kind of like investigate this phenomenon. And beyond just collection, but procuring of objects from different cultures, we were trading. This Southeast Asia, the different communities were trading amongst each other. Textiles, for example, was one of the most mobile products. So yeah, we just need to rethink about who or why we classify certain people collectors. But also with regards to the colonial collection, why not we also think about the other side, about the people who are giving up their objects? So turn the whole story around, or look at it from that angle, because some of these people were actually, I mean, we know tourism art, a lot of the objects in earlier Southeast Asian collections could have actually been more of tourism art, or at least they were made for the Western taste and Western aesthetics. But I guess I wouldn't call it Western aesthetic, but Western taste of what they think Southeast Asia looks like. So these people have certain agency on how they sold, they made these objects. Maybe we should also start looking at those angles as well. So we can still deal with colonial collections, but let's look at all the players involved. Yeah.
Can I jump in really quickly? Because there's actually the question that's got voted the most, I think, directly deals with this. So I think it's probably good to interweave some of these questions from the audience with the discussion when they relate directly. So on that note, yeah, Fiona Tan has asked, all these great attempts to decolonize the museum and allow local communities to engage with these collections. I am curious if there are attempts to recover voices of the colonized from the past, as the communities might see their history and refer to these items differently. Faisal and Conan, you've both spoke about this, but maybe this is a question. Have you actually started looking at specific communities yet that you could work with? I think it follows on nicely from what you just stated. So
I can start first. Yeah, I mean, for me, I have, and that's one of my first go-to approach whenever I start researching on something, which is to try to find someone within the community, if not an organization or institution, that I can run ideas by or talk to. So with the Chile, for example, I was very lucky to be able to have a conversation with Irina Agravina. She's an artist and researcher from Yogyakarta, and I mean, it's not Balinese, but we had conversations about Dewi Sri and significance of Dewi Sri, and she gave lots of perspectives. And we are trying to do that with many other different communities. So with Ranu Walum Foundation, for example, I've spoken to them. So yeah, it's baby steps for me, but the aim is we have I guess a direction. But the pandemic is making that a bit difficult, Stephen. But yeah.
Yeah. I think for the Hindu and Buddhist objects in the collection, we haven't exactly began to kind of do that in a very systematic way yet. I think, you know, with our engagements with the interreligious organization in Singapore that you know, we alluded to, we have been trying to get sort of perspectives from members of those religious communities to actually react to objects in the gallery that are from their religion. But I don't know if that's really the same as what you would say. You know, the questioner would say it's the same as recovering the voices of the colonized peoples at the time. You know, because obviously that it's not the same thing, right? Like, you know, these things were collected. You know, the places where they were collected from are not. It's not the same as a local community here in Singapore appreciating these objects. So I'm not really sure if there's an answer to that question. Although, you know, from what I tried to do in my presentation today, to try and uncover some of the how communities were actually you know, from where these clay tablets that I was talking about, where they were taken from, how they were actually interacted with the local communities. As I said, you know, the Buddhist monks would be actually taking them and you know, instead of putting them in a vitrine on display, they would actually grind them up and use them to make new Buddha images, because they had this kind of power. And I feel like there is a lot more there are opportunities for this in the colonial record, even obviously though it's imperfect, because we're not, you know, really listening to the voices of the people, just, you know, descriptive. But I think there is potential there in the research that we do.
Yeah, I think you hinted at it with as well, the fact that the ceilings were discovered in an area that is now primarily, the populations are primarily Islamic, so they would have focused on them as a different way. So it would be interesting to sort of reconnect with those communities, you know, in present day. You know, I think there's definitely scope for it. All right, sorry, Sujatha, do you have any want to?
Well, I mean, I'm thinking of, you know, it is a challenge to try to recover those voices. I mean, one could start looking at the artwork and see what, you know, what kind of traces these communities have left behind. I think Conan was certainly alluding to that in the way the seals were used. And sorry, I'm in a room where there's a sensor, and if I don't move, the lights go off, which I forgot. So, but I'm also thinking, I'm sort of that question, and then Faisal's and Conan's responses, and reminded me of some of the own work that I do on these Sri Lankan ivories made for the Portuguese court, and how Portuguese troops sort of destroyed these temples along the coast of Sri Lanka, and how it has been such a challenge to try to recover the art history of those regions. And it's only through these ivories it's you know, you can only do it to a certain extent, trying to figure out what you know, not what life was like back then, or what the carvers are trying to depict in those images. But it's something that we need to do.
Okay, I think I'm going to address some of the other questions as well. Actually, what I'm going to do is there's 2 or 3 questions that interrelate and touch on sort of some key topics about not just what we're talking about today specific to ACM, but also the whole question of decolonization. So I'll sort of I'm going to try and frame it into sort of a larger picture, so that you can, maybe then we can answer it as sort of one question. The first is Bradley's, who's been upvoted as well. I mean, he's really looking at the issue of positionality, and you know, who gets the right to speak for who, right? Who can speak about these issues? You know, he says it's virtually impossible to talk about cultural colonialism without mentioning racial equality. Who in academia has actually got the voice, students and scholars alike? Is it, of course, it is traditionally, and you could even argue still, overrepresentation of, say, white scholarship. So again, who gets to speak on this? Where should the balance be? Who gets privileged, who doesn't? And then Andrew Tan has a question and a comment. So I'll deal with the question, not the comment. Is decolonization, really what he's saying, is this just a fad, right? Is decolonization just a fad? Is it just the latest academic, thing that we're all getting excited about? Or is there actual value, heuristic value to it? Does it move discussions forward in a meaningful way? I think is what he's saying, or he's questioning, challenging what we're doing. And also, how do we judge? His comment is, how do we judge colonial collectors? The limitations that they're under, and the conditions they collected under. Should we, I guess that's another common critique of decolonization, is that perhaps we're judging the past by today's standards. I don't think that's what we're doing, but I think that is something that needs to be addressed, and maybe that can be, you can maybe address that issue. And then, sorry, I'm scrolling down, Dr. Hilmi, I think this is the other, for me, what's also an important aspect is if we get rid of colonial narratives, what replaces them? Do we replace them with national narratives, with localization narratives? Because if we create a vacuum, obviously, then it'll be filled by something. So I think you've touched on a lot of this already, but maybe you just want to sort of think of those three questions, comments, and how you would respond to them. I think in the ACM context, though, or within what you've spoken about today.
Well, there's quite a lot to unpack there. I will begin by, I think this is the important thing, is to say that I don't think decolonization is a fad. I think it's actually really integral to the museum remaining relevant, remaining important to communities wherever they are. I mean, whether it's in previously colonized countries like Singapore and Indonesia and so on, or in the West, right? In the British Museum, the Met, these all need to decolonize as well. And it's not a matter of I think necessarily doing away with everything that was colonial. I think that's to me it's kind of trying to obscure the histories of our nations, where we are today, the cultures. But it's about trying to understand them better, to contextualize them better. So kind of going back to the the question of, are we trying to judge these collectors, these colonial museum curators and so on in the past by today's standards? I don't really think that's the right way to frame it. I think it's about trying to historicize them in their context, and to I think it's kind of to address this sort of balance, right? That where in past colonial discourse, the colonial voice was seen as the most important, or at the top of the hierarchy. But now what we're trying to do is to try and equalize the other voices that have been forgotten or ignored, or kind of somehow silenced, and to try and put them on the same level through kind of doing this kind of historicizing work. And I think that is really decolonizing to me, to let in all these other narratives and other perspectives.
Okay.
Faisal,
Well, I think firstly, with regards to the question about who gets to tell these stories, right? I think both Conan and I, even Sujatha, have already mentioned about community voices. I think that needs to happen. And I know it's tricky sometimes. People don't know how to deal with collaborations, but we need to start collaborating with people across the globe. I think there's no excuse anymore to not do it. We like to work in our own little bubbles, in our own little laptops sometimes, but sometimes it's best, and that allows you to be able to make sure it's collaborations. I mean, true collaborations, not commissions. Collaborations would probably yield the best results. So you make sure that you are not enacting what the colonials were doing. And I mean, and with regards to the word decolonization or decolonizing, it gives a term for something that many of us have already been thinking about, especially, and going back to the previous question, especially ethnic minority scholars and academics and curators, or anybody in the field. We just, before the word colonizing was, well, fashionable with that, it was difficult for us to find something to latch on to, methodology even, but this gives a voice to it. And I know when people think of decolonizing the museum or anything, one of the first things they think about, oh, we want to forget the past, or we want to judge the past. We don't really. We want to keep addressing the past. We kind of love the past. No, we won't be in this field, but with different perspectives, with new lenses, with different lenses, diverse lenses, wider lenses, because much of the building blocks of academia, the academic world, the museum world, the perspectives and the approaches were built upon mostly Western ones. So we just want to make sure that we make it richer, but bringing in local and regional and alternative perspectives allow that. So that's what it means. I know it sounds very scary to some people, very aggressive, but it's actually not, in my opinion.
Yeah, actually, that makes me kind of think again of the question of what do we replace? What replaces the colonial, right? And to me, actually, the colonial is a state of mind where one group of people, a privileged group of people is seen as above all else. So yeah, in a way, I guess we are trying to undo that. But it doesn't mean that the voices of those who were at the top of the whatever hierarchy or even today are completely silenced. And actually, I think it's a call also to, it's not just about the past, it's about the present as well. I mean, it makes us think, who are the privileged voices today in our society? Who gets to speak now? And as curators, we're also trying to, I hope, right, we're trying to address that as well. And I think maybe there's a different issue altogether, but I think one of the things that we're doing at the museum to address this also is with our accessibility programs, to try and make sure a lot of other community groups and communities that don't necessarily think about going to the museum as something they do every day, or have issues that prevent them from enjoying our collections fully. And the way it is presented now, we're also trying to slowly, in very physical ways as well, to make our collections more accessible to all in Singapore and everywhere else. So Sujatha, do you have something to say?
I mean, you've both covered everything so beautifully, but I was also, thinking about what we can do, I guess, in academia, since one of these questions talks about cultural colonialism and academia and students and scholars having a voice, and even just simple things which both of you alluded to, like getting students to just go to the museum. For some of them, it might be even the first time when they write in their reflective essays or in their diary, their sort of weekly reflections, and or just getting students to also not only read the knowledge that's produced in centers of knowledge production in London or New York, or these universities in the US. So, but also making sure that we include essays, articles, books written by scholars producing knowledge in Asia. Just little baby steps matter, So it's and also going back to the question on, I guess, what are we going to replace it with? Yes, it could be a national narrative, but it could be localization, or looking to the region, or looking at global connections. But it's a challenge to do these completely replacing colonial narratives, because as one of the questions I think also mentioned something about how we have to rely on these colonial officials, and of course we do. We acknowledge them that they were collecting and they were writing. But it's always a challenge, I guess, trying to figure out what this decolonization is, whether it's in academia or in the museum world.
Great. Yeah, I don't have anything to add to what you've all said, but actually I wanted to pick up. If you don't mind, we'll keep going for about another 5-10 minutes. There's still a few more questions I'd like to address, but Faisal triggered something for me earlier about language, and I think it's really important as well, because there's a whole discussion about decolonization and language. And of course, again, this is, one of the aspects that there's also been workshops in Southeast Asian context about how to, about issues of translation or, publishing in native languages, Southeast Asian languages. Because again, that creates barriers if everything is in English, French, or Dutch, right? Depending on sort of the regions, or Portuguese, maybe in the Sri Lankan context and so forth. So I think, again, it's not about doing away with English language scholarship, or not referring to, a well-known professor in a US university. It's just about actually realizing that there could be just as much valuable information or completely new perspectives as Faisal has shown, in literature that's written in a Southeast Asian language. So that's another question, right? Another issue entirely about language issues, but it's completely, I think, related. All right, I'm going to take the next two questions together as well, because they actually address the same issue, and that's a very specific one to ACM. Azam Cesar asks about the usual, the colonial viewpoint of Islam, and how, of course, in the Raffles collection and so forth, it's completely underrepresented. So how should museums address the absence of Islamic objects in their display and the religious heritage of the region? I think ACM is doing that, but maybe one of you would like to talk about that a bit more. And then Christine Tan has also asked quite a specific question on collections, but she's more interested in fashion. So she's asking, she's curious how you would look at historical dress in the same decolonizing context, both in terms of how such traditional garments are still worn in the same way as they were decades ago, and how also some ways dress has drastically changed because of colonialism. So maybe you could address one each. Maybe, I think Conan's been working on the fashion a bit recently as well, so you might want to take that one, and Faisal may want to take the one on Islam. Yeah. Or vice versa.
Maybe I'll start.
Yeah, go ahead, Faisal.
Okay. Well, I mean, yes and no. I mean, I think, like, with regards to the collection, especially the old Raffles Library and Museum collection, yeah, it might seem like we don't have Islamic objects. So we need to also start thinking about what it means when we talk about Islamic objects as well, right? And that's a bigger discussion in itself, because there were far stricter categories in the past in what we can deem as Islamic objects. But some objects, for example, in the Malay Peninsula, they might not look like Islamic objects. They were also part of Islamic rituals or everyday kind of rites and stuff like that. And it's very difficult to pry what is Islamic and not from, say, a Malay culture. So there are ways to look at it with some of the objects. So what I'm talking about is like objects like the kris in certain Islamic traditions or festivals, or even just the use of certain textiles that might be just, non-sacred textiles, but they are worn for the everyday, which also include Islamic kind of rituals and moments and festivals, for example. We also need to start being open to the idea that something can be both Islamic and, say, Hindu and Buddhist. I mean, for example, most of us already know things like objects like the wayang topeng or even the wayang kulit were also used for dissemination of Islam, for example. But these are not things that were tackled or addressed by the earlier collectors. So, but I do agree that some of the objects that were, I guess, quintessentially Islamic, for example, headstones or batu nisan, for example, they're made of wood. We might not be able to have them. But I guess that's where we have to do the, preparations right now to make sure we have these objects that are current or even acquired from the community. And I think we also need to think about intangible heritage as well, collecting those kinds of documentation, for example, because a lot of the objects of this region, they are perishable. They are meant to, be consumed over time. So those things need to be considered. So we can start doing those legworks right now, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, Faisal. I think the remedy to you know, the absence of Islamic objects in the collection is really to start displaying Islamic objects in the museum.
And can I just add? I mean, and also our Islamic art curator Nora, she's doing a lot of that already. So that's why I think our Islamic art gallery is pretty well done, in my opinion. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, the Islamic gallery, which is part of our Faith and Belief galleries on the second floor, is, I think, one of the only galleries of Islamic art in the world to feature the art of Southeast Asia, to center Southeast Asia in that global sort of conversation. And you know, this requires also a lot of research on the collection itself, where many of these objects may have been you know, kind of not noticed or silenced, as you said. As for fashion, I think it's a similar, actually it's a similar, might be a similar thing, in the sense that a lot of the objects that the ACM has been collecting over the years, and even from the Raffles Museum time, objects that of Asian fashion have actually been categorized as ethnological objects. So they've been categorized as costume or you know, maybe life ceremony garments and so on. And I think so it is like a miscategorization to us now. And what we've been trying to do at the museum now with the opening of our fashion and design galleries in the third floor is really to try and look at our old collections, and also to you know, grow our collection, to rethink this idea of fashion. You know, it's just not, we don't want to limit it to just, you know, the idea of haute couture, which haute couture, high fashion really comes from a very specific moment in the colonial metropoles in Paris and London in the 19th century. We're trying to expand that view of fashion, that in Asia and Southeast Asia, there were actually many different forms, many different types of fashion that were developing at their own pace, you know, without any necessary any external interference. So that's really what we've been trying to do at the museum. I hope I've addressed that question. Yeah.
All right. I'm aware, I'm conscious of time, so I think we should probably wrap up. Unfortunately, there's a few questions left that are all interrelated, and maybe I would just sort of raise them, but we should, because I think they will come up in later talks in the series. Adrian talks about, you know, again, the definition of decolonization. It is a lot. I think it's a term that encapsulates a lot of different aspects. And he says it was not what he was expecting. Is it not ideas about ownership, power, and origins? I think you definitely addressed power and origins, but ownership, of course. So I think this is where we're getting into, you know, questions of repatriation and so forth. And I would just say that I think in lecture 5, Ricky Pandazan will definitely, I think, talk about those issues in more depth in terms of the Philippine collections in Michigan. And I think the talk next week may touch on it as well. But yeah, of course, I think it does. I think decolonization obviously refers to these talks about these as well. And Francis Lowe could also ask a similar question about is there ongoing efforts to repatriate or digitize artifacts that originated in Singapore, but were extracted during colonial times. I don't know if any of you want to comment on it really briefly, or we just bring it to a close. But I thought it was just important to acknowledge those two questions. All right.
Maybe I'll just quickly say something. I mean, yeah, I think repatriation is always a possible part of the solution. It's not going to be the solution. It's part of the solution, because it's not always useful for every case. And you know, and I think some of the previous speakers from the previous sessions have already mentioned this also. But as I mentioned earlier, some objects in the ACM collection were sold by people from their respective communities to collect, you know, to be collected by the Western colonials, the Western colonial collectors, for example. So we need to also respect those kinds of agency. So it's really very tricky for some of these objects. So we have to really identify the context of each object first. So, and it's possibly not a solution for every single object, right? So yeah, but it's for certain objects when it's really, really very obvious, where it's really questionable. I think a lot of those cases we've already seen in the media that this is a solution that lots of museums were actually open to. Yeah.
If I may just say one thing before we close, and just to note that actually, the work of decolonizing the museum is also not only the province of the curatorial department, and definitely at the ACM, our colleagues in the other departments, audience, which does programming and education, marketing, all the other departments in the museum are as important in decolonizing what we do at the museum. And actually, this is already a very big change from the colonial period, where the all-powerful curator making decisions and doing everything, right? So I just wanted to acknowledge, even though this webinar series is called decolonizing curating and the museum, a lot of what we've talked about, me and Faisal today, are actually also the work of our other colleagues in other departments as well. So yeah, just would like to acknowledge that.
Absolutely, yeah. I think museums have. I think in the broader context, museums have evolved over, say, the past 30 years to become more public-facing as well, right? So now we have a whole range of departments and professions within the museum, as opposed to definitely during the Raffles period or even up until the 1960s and so forth. And I think it's really important that Conan's brought it up, because this, as museums evolve, these questions of decolonization, I think, become much more relevant, and engagement with local communities and so forth. So yeah, I think we should frame it within broader developments of museums and museology as well. But yeah, on that note, I think I will bring this really great discussion to a close. I think we covered a lot of really important points today, and thank you for the questions as well. Really great questions from everybody. Really great to see people not only questioning but challenging as well. That's what we like to see. Yeah, and that's just all that's left for me is to thank Sujatha for being a wonderful discussant, and then of course Faisal and Conan for their excellent discussion today, and the audience. So hopefully I'll see some of you next week. That's it from us. Good night.